Myriam Nafte sees dead people, studies them and the people enthralled by them, to be more precise. She's a forensic anthropologist at McMaster University, and she joins us now to explain the historical and contemporary curiosity of human beings for human remains. Welcome, Myriam.
Thank you.
I read some of your thesis, and I'm actually really surprised by how creeped out I was by some of it. It's really fascinating, but why study human remains?
Well, my training is as a forensic anthropologist, so I've always been around human remains, and the point of studying human remains in a forensic context is to assert identity, to ascertain identity for a legal investigation. But my research went beyond that because I looked at the collection of human remains, amongst private collectors, anatomical specimens for museums, and also for buying and selling. Really, that human remains are everywhere outside of institutional collecting.
Which is really surprising. Why, like I said, that I got creeped out by reading. Why do you think that we're so, cautious about talking about death and dead, like human remains, being around that?
Well, curiously enough, the use of human remains is really not to remind us of death or to scare us or to create taboos around death. Mm-hmm. It's the opposite, rather. So for the case of institutional collecting with medical specimens, museums, that mummies and bog people, other archaeological collections and specimens, and also for the church, the Catholic Church, they have their own traditions of displaying human remains in the form of relics. These are not for death purposes, but really to remind us of a variety of things. So for institutional collecting, you have issues of identity and membership. If you belong to a certain museum, your remains represent the institution. So the more prestigious your collection, the more prestigious your institution. These aren't houses of death. Likewise with private collectors, collecting tribal art, shrunken heads, various carved skulls. These are about personal narratives, personal identity. Likewise with artists that have collected and used human remains. They're discussing their own life experiences. They're not warning us about death. They're not scaring us. And again, these are not about creating issues around death. But again, right, the opposite, it's celebrating life. And it's really an embedded tradition in Western society. It's not really anything new or recent.
I want to talk about the Catholic Church in a minute, but I wanted to make the distinction between something that you say in your thesis, between disposed and undisposed dead. What's the difference?
Well, with the circulation of human remains in our society, these are remains that have been either exhumed for a variety of reasons, or they have never been disposed of. So they haven't been contained. The disposed dead really represent the issues of death and grief and mourning and memorialization. Largely, the disposed dead are the dead that we know. They've been identified, their loved ones, or their
family members,
marked, family members, etc. They're not anonymous. The undisposed dead are, for the most part, anonymous dead. We don't really know who they are and how they've arrived where they are. For example, mummies and bog people and archaeological specimens and medical specimens and so on. There's very rarely a name attached to these individuals. So that was the focus of my research, or largely those remains that are circulating throughout society.
And I wanted to talk about the Catholic Church.
Yes.
Let's go back a bit in time. And the Catholic Church has played an important role in our interest in human remains. How?
Funny enough, when you read the academic literature, in a lot of my research, the issue was that the Catholic Church, or the assertion was that the Catholic Church was against anatomical research and against anatomical dissection. But I argued the opposite, is that as a result of the Catholic Church's traditions of making and displaying relics, that's why we have a tradition of dissection medicine. So really, modern medicine, dissection anatomy specifically, is an upshot of the Catholic Church.
So when did the Catholic Church get this reputation of being anti-science?
I think throughout there was this sense, it was actually mistaken interpretation of a papal decree in the late 1200s, in the 13th century, where the Pope was thought to have prevented, or at least made it illegal for Catholics to open up and divide the body, or to dismember, burn, or boil remains. But actually it was a funerary requirement to not bring back these remains. Of course, the Crusades were quite popular at the time, and there was a lot of that going on. There were a lot of dead bodies coming back across Europe. They wanted to prevent another plague, and they wanted to prevent bodies from arriving with, festering maggots and highly decomposed. So he was essentially asking them to bury them where they were, rather than trying to bring them across and, dismember them and carry them back to their place of origin.
And in that sense, bringing the disease back, or
bringing the diseases back, right? Yeah. Really, there was no taboo with the dead body, because most of the Catholic churches at the time, as they still are, house human remains.
So what would the spiritual reason be for opening up a corpse?
Well, there are a variety of reasons. We really have the foundation of the first autopsies happening in churches, opening up bodies to look at organs, to understand, if this was a pure heart, if this was a criminal heart, the cause of death. And I think there was also the element of preserving a lot of these pieces, especially if they were nobility, if they were clergy, martyrs, holy people, future saints, etc., and they would have provided for those, not mummification per se, but preservation, a variety of methods of preserving them, and then housing them in reliquaries for veneration.
I thought it was really interesting reading part of your thesis, where churches were built on relics, and then people became more powerful because they actually owned these human bodies.
Right, yeah, there's a proliferation of them throughout the early Middle Ages and early medieval times of building these what became massive cathedrals, but they were originally shrines. So they are burial grounds, and they also house a lot of remains embedded in altars and walls and underground. And that was really the difference too with the Reformation, with the Protestant Reformation, is that they removed all of that. They removed the dead body from the church. And again, those are the major split. That's the major split in terms of distinguishing between the two. So with the Catholic Church, you still have this veneration of the remains of the dead being very important and vital to the continuity of the church. That's something I think a lot of people have dismissed as being this outdated tradition, but it's not. It's very current, and it's still very powerful.
And when did Western medicine become interested in human remains?
Well, as a result of the traditions of the church. So you see, the early anatomy schools were really located in the sources of papal power, and they're paying for it, essentially. They had supported it very much so. The flowering of anatomy, anatomical research came about in the early Renaissance. It was being done already within the Catholic Church, but then you have papal centers paying for the growth of anatomy schools. So the interest really flowers then in anatomical research, and also preserving remains.
What did the general public at the time think of using dead bodies in this way?
I think it was very common, and those who were going to anatomy schools were used to seeing these public dissections. They were also events that you could pay to attend. If you were of the noble class or aristocratic, you could pay and observe a dissection, and it was also a sense of it was a festive time as well. It was very celebratory. It was very fascinating for the people because it was unusual. As well, if there was an infamous criminal, that was also part of the continuity of their punishment. If they had been hung at the gallows, then the body would be taken for dissection, and that was considered possibly redeeming for that individual religiously.
I just find it interesting that these were unknown people, or they had committed a crime, how these unknown bodies were being watched in, I guess, entertainment, education by people with money. It's like it's creating a hierarchy. And you also say that the living usurp the dead.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
In terms of imposing their own narratives and their own identity, and it comes through institutional collecting. So once again, if you have a very prestigious collection, it's not about the individuals in that collection. It's about the institution that houses that collection. So you have very famous medical museums around the world now, getting more and more popular through social media. And it's really about their authority and their institution and knowledge. Because the idea is that you are gauging, you are creating an opportunity for knowledge and information and education, and also you're creating avenues for learning about these individuals, but providing access to the dead in sanctioned ways. And likewise with the church, it's not about you as an individual coming to see this relic or venerating this relic, but about celebrating the power of the Catholic Church, at the same time celebrating that individual's martyrdom and their holiness and their ability to intervene on your behalf. So you would pray to these saints to ask for help, to ask for guidance, wisdom, healing, and these saints would intervene on your behalf. So it's their inherent power.
And nowadays, you can buy human remains on Craigslist?
Everywhere.
That's astonishing.
Everywhere. It's
How
not
big is this
unusual.
market?
It's massive because it's worldwide, and it's largely uncontrolled. And this is also, with my research, looked at the loopholes that provide opportunities to buy and sell human remains. It's very easy to do that. A lot of graves have been plundered. A lot of human remains make their way onto social media and into auctions, private collections, and it's easy to do. And
Are there any rules or laws governing?
There are a lot of rules and regulations and laws, but people get in and through them. If you can purchase your remains as medical specimens, then somehow that passes. But it's very difficult, especially to the untrained eye, to distinguish between forensic remains and anatomical specimens. It's easy to take remains and create the idea that these are old medical pieces. And oftentimes that's what's done. So they're easy. And then a lot of people coming from Eastern Europe, there's a lot of renovations and excavations that interfere with burial remains, burial grounds. And it's easy to throw in skulls in your knapsack as a trekker through Europe and then bring them home and sell them or put them into your collection.
Now, how would you characterize somebody who wants to own human remains?
Well, you find that it's very popular amongst young people. It's a goth tradition. That's something that's very celebrated. And it's also considered quite, I think, status making if you've got a good personal collection. You often see that on social media. A lot of people they acquire notoriety or fame if they've got this massive collection of human remains, and somehow they're cool, and they are knowledgeable, or they have membership to some cool club. It's along those lines. The remains that have pedigree, that have been acquired through a variety of dealers, and they were bought for a high price at auction, they're going to have the biggest price. They're going to have that you're going to acquire that status through the pedigree of those remains. If they are prized relics, those also fetch a high price at market. Then there's the black market, where it's, the dealers and the private collectors know what's really popular and what is desirable. Bill Jamison was one of the largest collectors in Ontario, in Canada, really. And he housed a lot of these.
Who was Bill Jamison?
Bill Jamison was a private collector here in Toronto. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he had a very prestigious collection because it was mixed in with high-end art and historical artifacts. So once his collection broke up through various auctions, it's acquired a pedigree. So if you're able to acquire a Jamison's piece, it's already worth a lot on the market.
So maybe one day we would be worth more?
It depends. And it depends on who you were and how you arrived in someone's collection. Tribal art is also very, very expensive because it's rare and it's old, and a lot of it is quite beautiful, and they come from different parts of the world.
And in your thesis, you talked to several artists who incorporate human remains into their art.
Yes.
How do they do this?
Well, I looked at 5 artists that were essentially well established. So they are not young. They've been at this for several decades. And they did so in a variety of ways. One is Joel Peter Witkin. He's got a cult following. He's 3 feature documentary films about his life. And he basically walked into morgues and assembled these tableaus with flowers and fruits and props and human remains and photographed them. And his photographs are very, very expensive art pieces. And he has prestigious shows in museums and galleries around the world. So I looked at his work, and I looked at others that integrate human skin or bones or fetal hearts, in the case of Wayne Martin Belcher, who makes cameras, photographs individuals with these human remains integrated as part of his camera.
And he was taking pictures of pregnant women.
That was with the fetal heart camera, yes.
Yeah.
But he also has a camera where he has the HIV positive blood acting as a filter, and he does portraits of HIV positive individuals as, again, a part of a gallery installation.
We have an image of a human skull taken by Ryan Matthew Cohn, a bone collector and artist who sells antiques like this on his website. Now, people might look at this and say it's just an old human skull from another time. What are some ethical considerations one should have before buying something like this?
Well, in that situation, this is a Kapala skull. This is from an old Buddhist tradition. So these are not unusual in Nepal and Tibet, for example. They have a rich tradition, Buddhist tradition, of using human remains for a variety of reasons, for ritual reasons. And in that case, for drinking and celebrating and calling on the dead. It's part of a prayer tradition. So these remains are not unusual, and they're not difficult to get. In terms of ethical considerations, well, if you're a Buddhist, there aren't any ethical conditions or preconditions. These are required for a variety of prayers and rituals. For individuals like Ryan, he's got an extensive private collection of his own, and he buys and sells all the time. Ethical considerations, it's a tricky question because these are part of our material culture. They're all, again, worldwide, and they arrive at us through a variety of means. But I would say to keep an eye out on where these remains are from to determine whether these are forensic or not. But again, if with an untrained eye, it's difficult to ascertain this, next to impossible.
Do you have any human remains?
I don't. I have pieces that are an anatomical collection that I use for teaching, but I don't have a private collection myself, no.
And you also write about dark tourism.
Yes.
What is that?
Dark tourism refers to the practice of visiting places of disaster, where death has occurred, public executions, torture, these sorts of places that tend to fascinate people. So you usually have these, they are tourist sites, and people arrive because they know of what's happened at this particular site. And these, again, these are all over the world, and they attract people for a variety of reasons. The thrill that knowing something has happened, something bad has happened here. And oftentimes they house remains or pictures or at least a graphic description of what went on. And then you have tour guides explaining the graphic details. They may house artifacts from that time. The more authentic these places are, the more popular they are.
It sounds like we have an obsession with how people die or with death. Is it because we all know it's just around the corner? And we don't want to think about it, or?
I think there's there's both that. There's a paradox. We're fascinated by it, we're afraid of it, but we know it's inevitable, and yet we try and prevent it. Largely, I find that the people that are the most fascinated with death and wanting these death experiences are people that are young and healthy. You're not really faced with your own mortality. It's an exciting time. These are people that often enjoy horror movies or being afraid, through haunted castle walks and death walks, and they like hearing the stories, the grisly details in the stories. For those of us who have been at crime scenes that are quite graphic and very disturbing, I tend to avoid them simply because I have a very different reality associated with them, with experiencing that. Likewise, you find with people who are terminally ill or they're elderly and fragile, I don't think they're going to enjoy that experience as much.
So we were talking about dark tourism. We have an example of one of these sites, and this is the Clink Prison, a museum based in London, England. When did this tradition of visiting sites where death occurred begin?
Well, it's only actually been written about in the academic scholarship probably beginning in the mid-90s. There was a fascination with the JFK assassination. And so you have authors, Foley and Lennon, for example, they coined the term dark tourism, referring to the JFK assassination and the kind of fascination around that. But for the most part, the practice has been quite long embedded. It's a long history.
Do you think that now with the rise of social media, it's just
even
becoming more commonplace?
Absolutely, yeah. People are fascinated with hearing other people's experiences. They post a lot of photographs and images around popular sites, a lot of obscure sites, and then new sites, relatively, like the Chernobyl site, where that's attracting a lot of people coming in and photographing deserted, abandoned sites where an obvious disaster has occurred, that give people a cheery, illing feeling. There's the look of decay and death, and those apparently are becoming more and more popular.
I want to show you a selfie or an image. And this is a selfie a young girl took on a trip to Auschwitz a couple of years ago. How do you make sense of someone taking a selfie like this at the site of one of history's worst atrocities?
It's not unusual. It happens a lot, and there are 1,000 more images of these. So it was not something that's atypical, especially of that generation, the selfie generation, and where photographs are everywhere. It's unusual to find these images amongst professionals that are actually with human remains. So in pathology labs, in autopsy situations, or amongst people doing autopsies or crime scene investigations or death scenes, you don't find people taking selfies because there's a professional element involved and there's also an element of respect required. And also you'll be thrown out of your profession or your office if you're doing that. But I think those other images where there are buildings and it's sort of the setting is ambiguous. Mind you, you do find photographs in catacombs and amongst mummified remains in museums that are not unusual. Again, these are the anonymous dead, and it doesn't seem to be much of a breach of ethics because you don't have next of kin or family members that can complain about this or cause an uproar.
Do you think it's just youth, or do you think we're just too blasé about death now?
I think for the most part it is a youth issue where it's fun and games, and it really isn't about death. This is about popularity in social media, in the case of the selfies. In other situations where you have public executions still around the world, we don't have that tradition here anymore in North America, in the Western society, but you still have that in other non-Western societies, and you have images proliferating, social media, of live executions. These are not unusual. These are becoming more and more popular, but it was also much of our own tradition. So at the turn of the last century, there were photographs of public executions. When photography was first coming out, there was a lot of memento mori photography as well, where people, it was expensive to take photographs for family members. If you could afford that one photograph, it was oftentimes the last photograph of that individual. So you have a lot of individuals photographed in their coffins, at their funeral, or laid out in their bed. There's that element of photography. That hasn't gone away either, because that's also still with us. And then you have the public execution photographs, and then the whole genre of lynching photography that was also very popular. And these were created as postcards that were sent out to relatives across reporters that couldn't attend. And it was to catch everybody up on what the news was.
Even on the news, you see images of car crashes and of, you see a body, even though it's covered, it's obviously, if that's your family member,
Yes.
it probably impacts you differently.
It's fairly tame here in North America compared to, let's say, South America, where the front pages are very grisly and very graphic, and people find that quite normal. It's been fairly normalized because death is so common and very very visualized in these cultures. It's considered poor taste for our front page newspapers covering crime scenes and accidents for them to be as graphic. Newspapers oftentimes reject those photographs. These photographs exist, and sometimes they find their way into social media or private collections of such crime scene photographs. But for the most part, newspapers would reject putting that on the front page. They try, I think. There's a little bit of titillation in trying to cross that boundary to see how far they can get. It used to be the case in the 1950s, 1960s. If you compare early newspaper photographs of crime scenes, we've toned it down considerably.
Thank you so much for being here. It's been a fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being on the agenda in the summer.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.